So, in the spirit of difficulty settings, I've decided to write this script in a sort of hard mode. That's right, bitches, your boy's about to drop a whole fucking video on difficulty in video games without mentioning Dark Souls once. Okay, you ready? Here we go. Blood-Borne is infamous for its arduous combat and brutal gameplay. It can be pretty intimidating for the uninitiated to even give it a go, and being constantly mangled to death by the lowest level guys in the game is hardly an encouraging start. But as tempting as it may have been to add an easier difficulty option, From Software would have run the risk of robbing the player of an experience they were intended to have. Hidetaka Mario Kart, the lead designer for games like Blood-Borne and Dark Souls, just Blood-Borne, has said, "We don't want to include a difficulty selection because we want to bring everyone to the same level of discussion and the same level of enjoyment. We want everyone to face the same challenge and to overcome it in some way that suits them as a player. By keeping everything at one fixed difficulty, you can be sure that the entire game is designed exactly around what's in front of you. There's no grey area. This is how the game was meant to be experienced." And then there's shit like this.
Moderate crush... like, relative to what? Can't use lock-on. Is that important? Would I be doing that a lot? Lean visibility. What the fuck? Well, I've seen Shaun of the Dead like 4 times. So I guess I could be considered an expert.
Like, the challenge is such a core part of the experience, I'm not really sure it's something we should be leaving up to the player to decide. Look at Metal Gear Solid 3, for example. Now, full disclosure, I think this game is the best shit ever. Like, on the list of mankind's greatest creations, it goes the pyramids, automobiles, penicillin, the internet, and then way up here is Metal Gear Solid 3. After that, we should have probably just stopped making stuff. We'd like peaked as a species. But if you play it on one of the easier difficulty settings, you're missing out on so much of what makes the game great. On expert mode, you'll find yourself capturing live snakes and throwing them at guards, blowing up storage houses, tricking enemy patrols into eating rotten food, holding dudes up at gunpoint, shooting out the radios, and just getting into all kinds of wacky shenanigans. Did you know that when you get to Granny Gorky, you can disguise yourself as a scientist and intentionally get caught by the guards to get escorted into the building you're trying to infiltrate?
The building. Ah, yes, this might actually work. Oh man. Oh man, this game. Yes, back to the lab.
I've saved played through this game like a dozen times at this point. I only learned that shit like 3 days ago. The problem is, if you're playing on one of the easier difficulty settings, it's far too easy to just trank, shoot, or slam your way through almost every situation. So why would you bother doing all this weird shit that keeps the game interesting? Or what if you were playing on expert from the get-go, but you kept dying, so instead of messing around with the game's mechanics, you just dropped down to a lower difficulty setting, robbing yourself of all the fun you could have been having just because you got stuck at one part? Like, my deepest shame in life is when I was like 15 and I lowered the difficulty setting in Dead Space 2 so I could beat the last boss. That was back in 2011 and I straight up think about that like once a week. I'm not even joking, I have ex-girlfriends I haven't thought about in years, but fucking Dead Space 2 keeps me up at night. Now, this isn't to say that difficult is always better. When I played Uncharted 4, I started the game on crushing and I just got hammered into the fucking ground.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
It's hard to feel like you're on an Indiana Jones-esque swashbuckling pirate adventure when every time you pop out of cover you end up deader than Kevin Spacey's acting career. Slap the game down to easy and you can get away with doing all sorts of crazy shit. The Uncharted games are much more enjoyable on the lower difficulties because you're given the freedom to move about and play around. On crushing, I found myself spending most of an encounter taking cover behind the same waist-high wall. I mean, which looks like more fun. This? Or this? But then the opposite is true in The Last of Us. I had way more fun playing that game on grounded difficulty than I did on any of the easier options. The theme, settings, and tone of that game all lend themselves to an unforgiving gameplay experience. And the game is, in my humble opinion, objectively and inarguably better if you're playing without the use of listen mode, which basically grants the player the ability to see through walls. Like, without it you're encouraged to move cautiously and really pay attention to your surroundings, which works really well in a survival horror setting. But how could you possibly gauge the importance of a mechanic like that before you even hit start? Why is it my responsibility to design your game all of a sudden? See, this is the benefit of only having one difficulty setting, like in Dark Souls... like in Zelda. You can be sure what you're experiencing is exactly what the developers had in mind, so when you walk into an area and get the absolute head kicked off of you, you're not worried about whether or not it's just because you're on hardcore, nightmare extreme, no girls allowed mode, or whatever the fuck. Difficulty is one of the main reasons the open world in Breath of the Wild works so well. You can't just waltz on up to Hyrule Castle, because the enemies will make short work of you if Link doesn't have enough, I don't know, gumption. So you're encouraged to explore and learn and have fun.
I call this one the rock bottom. Yeah!
Or you could just fucking catapult yourself over the castle walls and Pete Kennedy to death with a mop or something, I don't know. There was so much thought and care put into the world design of Breath of the Wild, and there's a reason we can't alter the difficulty setting, because it was intentionally and meticulously fine-tuned over the course of development to ensure that you, the player, has exactly the experience that was FUCK! Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying a difficulty select screen is always a bad idea. Games from Kirby's Epic Yarn to Shadow of Mordor lost my interest long before the end credits on account of how easy they were. The problem with only having one difficulty setting is that if you don't absolutely nail it, then everyone gets an inferior product. I remember I played through Valkyria Chronicles recently and I quickly fell in love with it. I thought the gameplay was original and interesting and the artwork was charming, but the more I played I started to realise the game was just letting me win. The AI constantly behaved in ways that didn't further its objective or achieve its goal, which always made victory feel hollow. Not only that, but it also retroactively nulled any previous sense of accomplishment as soon as I realised what was happening. It also never fully commits to its permadeath mechanic, which I thought was frustrating. Like, I finished the whole game without a single one of my guys dying. If they fall in battle, you can just call a medic and then redeploy them the next turn. Not like XCOM, which never holds your hand and makes you feel the full pressure of permadeath. It's punishing and challenging, but it always feels fair.
Didn't see this one coming.
Almost always. Basically, Valkyria Chronicles is like your babysitter letting you win at Snakes and Ladders, and then XCOM is like chess, it did a shitload of cocaine and then fucked your wife. I would have loved if Valkyria Chronicles had an option to up its difficulty or increase the severity of its permadeath. So, here's my dilemma. On the one hand, I think we should trust developers to craft an experience they want the player to have and that we shouldn't risk compromising a well thought out design. But on the other, I'm definitely in favour of giving the player more options or tools that allow them to tailor an experience to better suit their taste or ability. Now that's a mean case of doublethink I got going on here. So, what's the solution? Well, I think games like Darkest Dungeon and Celeste have the right idea, where there's only one difficulty setting, but you have all sorts of options that allow you to alter the game's mechanics if you want. What's important though is that the developers use clear and concise language to let you know that this is not how the game was intended to be played. With Darkest Dungeon, instead of a difficulty setting, there's a configuration menu which allows you to change loads of core gameplay features. But before you can mess around with any of those settings, you get a little pop-up that reads, Gameplay settings as intended to be played. Turning this off allows you to toggle the gameplay features below. See, nothing's getting lost in translation here. I know exactly what the developer's intentions are, and I know that by changing any of these settings, I'm messing with the core design of the game. But it's still nice to have the option. It's almost more like a cheat code than a difficulty setting. Like I said before, I feel The Last of Us is best enjoyed without the use of listening mode, and I think if your weapons didn't break in Breath of the Wild, then the game would. But I also like the idea of maybe being able to toggle those options for people who are struggling, provided there's no confusion that this is not the experience that the developers intended. Celeste and Mario Odyssey follow a similar tune with their assist modes. I'm also all for the inclusion of gimmicky difficulty settings like Iron Man mode in XCOM, which saves after every move so you can't just reload a save if everything goes tits up, or European Extreme in MGS3, which gives you game over as soon as Snake gets spotted.
Still. Why? Alright. We're off to a great start here.
I think I'm fine with these because no one's really playing through the game their first time with these settings, so they're really just there to add replayability. Another trick that developers can use is a dynamic difficulty setting. In Pokemon Yellow, your rival will change what he evolves as Eevee into based on how many times you've lost to him in the past, which makes the game easier or more challenging depending on how well you've been doing, which is a nice touch, especially since it can throw players for a loop on subsequent playthroughs. Zombie Kickers 4 will be more generous with your loot if you're not playing particularly well, and will even go as far as to remove enemies altogether if you're getting your ass kicked particularly hard. The issue with this approach is that if players cop on, they might feel robbed out of a challenge or that they're having their hand held, which can be even more frustrating. You can also sort of hide a difficulty setting in your game if you're really clever about it. For example, you'll have a much easier time if you choose to place a spellcaster instead of a melee character in... oh, look at that, we're out of time. Scoreboard? Nailed it! Anyway, that's about it for today. So be sure to join us next time when our topic will be how to tell the difference between Troy Baker and Nolan North. Oh yeah, I always do get those two mixed up.
Now
Hold me close and hold me fast. This magic spell.
Oh, fuck. Oh, I swallowed a bug.